another big edition of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains. And why is it big? Because we have a chance right now to talk to our own Larry Hedrick about his experiences with Apacheland.
My job out at Queen Valley, living in the rock house and running cattle, was over. I got into Pete for about $800, and he stood out in front of the rock house and waved his hand out there and said, "I'll trade you some land rather than the money." And I declined. And today that land is right in the middle of the golf course out there.
Larry, how did you get started at Apacheland?
How I found Apacheland is a mystery to me, because there was no Gold Canyon. You know, Gold Canyon didn't really get started until about 1974 when Harold Chris put it all together. But somebody must have told me about it, and I just showed up and wearing my cowboy duds that I wore every day, but I did have my gun strapped on. And there was nothing at Apacheland. There was no main street or anything like that. It hadn't been built yet. And there was just one single row of buildings that they called Hangtown. And I stood there with a small crowd watching skits being put on. And it was all put on to audio. The audio was telling the story. The people were just reenacting what they heard on the audio. And when the crowd dispersed after a skit, I just kind of mingled with the players and kind of got accepted that way. And then one day, somebody didn't show up, and this guy that was the sheriff, which was about a 6'6" guy, and I don't remember anybody's name out there, but he just says, "Get out there and do it." What do I do? He says, "Just listen to the tape and do what the tape says." So I used to walk out in the middle of the street, and there was a girl coming my way, a late teenager. And as I moved, she changed her course to match mine. She coming straight at me, and I'm not hearing anything. I'm just sitting there worried about what's going to happen. And she gets right up against me, and a gun goes off, and she falls right in my arms. And I lay her down, and I'm not hearing anything that they're talking about on that audio. I'm just reacting to what happened. And I look where the gunshot come from, and there was a guy standing there with his gun in his hand in an alleyway, and I drew my gun and started after him, and the sheriff come along and took the gun away from me, and like to tore my fingers off, you know. And so that's the way the first one happened. And I was listening to him a little bit later, and I heard the sheriff say, "Well, I liked his acting. I actually had to take a gun away from him," you know. So from then on, they started using me. There was no pay. It was just, you know, I had that $800, you know, and that today that was the purchasing power of about $7,000 today. And I wasn't looking for a job or anything. I was just having fun and running around. And so one weekend we were out there, and I happened to be behind the row of buildings, which were not complete. They didn't have any doors or windows on the sides. The fronts were complete, but there was an obvious intention to finish them up. And I happened to walk by the back of this one building and looked in, and there sat Clint Walker on a couch. Surprised the heck out of me. And I struck up a conversation with the guy. And just about that time, Charlie Aldridge come in and just ripped me up one side and down the other. "Who let you in here? You know, I ought to throw you off the set." You know, the guy just ripped me something terrible. And I just turned around and walked away. And 50 years later, I was over at Scottsdale at one of the festivals of the West, and there's that Clint Walker selling pictures and books and stuff. So I got in this long line, and when I got up to Clint, I said, "Say, listen, do you remember being out at Apacheland?" He said, "Oh yeah, that was 1959. And I said, "Do you happen to remember some kid talking to you?" And Aldrich started ripping on him. He says, "Yeah, I remember that. I felt so sorry for that kid." I said, "Well, that was me." So, you know, it was just a month or two later that the giant pagoda of the Superstitions took place. And when that was over, I went back to Oklahoma for my birthday to see my mother. And it was 6 years before I came back. I came back permanently to Arizona in 1966. So I went out to Apacheland and to see, and here it was all complete. It was a wonderful place, large crowds and more skits going on, but they weren't using the audio anymore. And I didn't have much to do with Apacheland for the next few years.
Larry, I'm impressed. I hear you have a lot of pull with the Air Force.
I do remember being out there one time when some director was trying to film a movie. The planes from William Air Force Base were just destroying him. Every time he tried to say anything, here come a jet. And he was so frustrated there. About the sixth time that happened, he just threw everything down on the ground and says, I don't know what we're going to do. And I said, I walked up to him and I said, well, why don't you call Williams Air Force Base and have them change the flight path? Well, they wouldn't do that. I said, they'll do it. They cooperate very well with you. You call Williams Air Force Base, ask to talk to the officer on the flight line, and tell them who you are and what you're doing, and I'll bet you they'll change the flight paths. They've got several flight paths. And so he went in the office, and about 10 minutes later he come out, and he just stood there for a little while. Wasn't a plane in the air. And so he started filming, and he never even looked over and said thanks. But anyway, in the late 70s, I formed the Cavalry reenactment unit. And about half my guys were on the west side of Phoenix, and most of those had horses. And the guys out here in the East Valley, we were always going over to Pioneer Village or Ron Nix's A Day in the West, way west of Phoenix, to do things. And I was kind of looking for a home, so I went out to Apacheland and made a deal with Sue Sillerman. And we went out on the back lot, and the back lot was nothing more than a junkyard. It was horrible. Just every piece of trash you could imagine was out there in this 10 acres. So I called in all the infantry and artillery guys and my cavalry, and we spent a couple of weekends just cleaning that place up. And we removed all the junk from that 10 acres out behind the place to the east. You know, Apacheland had a fort wall in the front and guard towers, and this was to be our home. And we done a lot of things there just for ourselves, reenactments and stuff, and inviting other units from around the state to come in. And from time to time, we did our own little skits for what crowd was there, and it was just a lot of fun. But it was '79 that we decided to do a major event, and we publicized it very well. And this was called a Prelude to Gettysburg. And we had infantry redoubts and a little rock wall for Pickett's charge, because that's what we were reenacting. And we set up explosives and set off charges and all that, and we had all our casualties planned out. And there was over 1,000 people there to watch this thing. And it was on July 4th. It was pretty warm. We called Apacheland our home until about 1983. But in the early 80s, Red Wolverton was managing the place, and he was trying to buy it. The price, if I recall at that time, was $1.5 million for Apacheland. And every time he went in to try to make a deal, the price went up. And he got pretty frustrated about it. But Red is well known in the movie industries. You've probably seen his stagecoach many times in many movies and just didn't even know who it was. But he had a Concorde stagecoach that was made back east. It just absolutely 100% authentic, and it cost $64,000. And he had all his own horses. He always run a 6-up team, and it was my privilege one time. He allowed me to drive his stagecoach, and that was a real experience to drive a 6-up team. And but he finally got frustrated and went down to Old Tucson. And that's where most of his movie making was done. It was Old Tucson. And he used to rent stuff from me for the movies. He rented all my saddles for Hubba Bubba bubblegum commercials, and he rented a wagon from me and attached a team of horses to it, and I drove it in a race that they didn't tell me I wasn't supposed to win. His daughter was supposed to win a race in another wagon, and there was about 20 wagons involved in this race. And that was an exciting experience, I want to tell you, going out of there at full speed. And his daughter liked to never talk to me again. And of course, we had to reshoot the whole thing because she had to win. And then about, Ron Nix was out there all the time. He helped build the main street of Apacheland. I don't know if he was involved in Hangtown or not, although he talked a lot about it like he was involved. If he was there when I was, I don't remember him because I don't remember anybody's names. And our paths crossed many times in movies and commercials, and we didn't even know each other. And but he had me collaborate with him to use my Cavalry to a day in the West out at what was called Cowtown at that time. And we made several movies and commercials out at Cowtown with the Cavalry and things like that. And it was just a wonderful time at Apacheland. It was just our home base for the Cavalry.
Well, there you have it. Mystery solved. Larry Hedrick and his association with Apacheland. This guy is not just a pretty face.